And hopefully this lesson will help to create a little bit more context for them so you can see what they mean in addition to just stressed sounds, but how that's actually applicable to your reading and understanding of poetry, okay? So specifically, we're going to start with the sonnet. So typically when someone thinks of the sonnet, they associate it with Shakespeare. But we're going to go a little bit further back in history and just break it down a little further. So the term sonnet is a classical short poem, and the word is actually representative of the Italian word sonnet that means little song. So I would think that that would be useful to have in your notes so that you can make that connection. A little song and sonnet. Okay, and so the difference, when we think about the difference between poetry and music, lyrical qualities are all obviously consistent, but what's like the main difference between music and poetry? What's in music that isn't always in poetry? A beat, a rhythm, exactly. Okay, so what makes a sonnet different than other forms of like free verse poetry is the element of rhythm. And so that's really what meter is all about, how to measure and track rhythm in poetry. Okay, so the sonnet, little song. The granddaddy of the sonnet was the Italian poet Francesco Petrarch, and he lived in 14th century Italy. He was the originator of the sonnet poetry form. And in his day, kind of the original subject was based entirely on love and beauty and all things mushy. So this guy, Petrarch, he wrote over 300 sonnets, all focused on addressing the same girl, Laura. Okay, if that was like today, having someone write you poetry or a song in your honor might be, kind of complimentary, but 300 poems about the same girl might be a little bit much. So Petrarch, he's kind of like the grandfather of the sonnet, but we don't really think of him like today in modern context. Usually we think of British literature or the English poets like Sir Thomas Wyatt and Shakespeare. So in the 16th century, English really hadn't made its way as like a prominent, respectable language yet. And so Sir Thomas Wyatt, who you guys are familiar with because we read some of his poems in the last unit, he started interpreting Petrarch's Italian sonnets. So he wasn't really writing his own, but he was interpreting them into English to kind of further advance that style and just appreciation for it throughout English-speaking countries. So went from Petrarch to Wyatt, and then in the same decade, Edmund Spenser was the next fella who he took those interpreted Italian sonnets and he put an English twist on it. He started to change the rhyme scheme and kind of make it his own. Okay? And then eventually in the 17th century, Shakespeare got his hands on it. And so today we call it either the Shakespearean or the English sonnet, and that's mainly what we're going to focus on just because that's sort of what's the most available, and when we think and hear about sonnets today, that's kind of what we're familiar with. So the key components of a sonnet. Do you remember how many lines there are? 14 lines, okay? 14 lines, and at least in the English sonnet, the form is broken down into 4 different stanzas, okay? So you know the math. If there's 4 stanzas and 14 lines total, that means that the first 3 stanzas are going to be quatrains, and then the last one is a single rhyming couplet. Oops. 3 quatrains and 1 rhyming couplet. Okay, so those are kind of like the nuts and bolts. In addition to that is a really specific rhyme scheme. Okay, so the rhyme scheme looks a bit like this: A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and so we have the first 3 stanzas right here, and then if the last one is going to be a rhyming couplet all on its own, what letters are going to follow this pattern? G, G. Bingo. G and G. Okay? In addition to this, and this is really what kind of left Shakespeare's legacy, and this is what brings us to this idea of using meter in poetry, is that in addition to following this classic form, Shakespeare also really tediously incorporated a clear pattern of rising and falling stresses in the words that he chose and the way that he arranged them. Okay, so we have this term, iambic pentameter. So just to hear the term iambic pentameter sounds kind of long and fancy, and you've maybe heard it, attributed to Shakespeare in the past, but we can break it down into smaller parts and associate to vocabulary that you already know. So let's start with the iamb, because I know you all passed your quiz months ago. So what is an iamb? Anyone remember?
A stress syllable.
Say it again.
A stress syllable.
Okay, one stress syllable. Can anyone build on that? Okay, so
So
it's
it
a
goes from stress to unstressed. Unstressed to stress.
unstressed to stress. Okay, so it's a combination, right? So it's instead of it just being one syllable, it's a unit of measurement that measures an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Unstressed to stressed. Okay? So an iamb. Do you remember what is the opposite of an iamb? If an iamb is one unit of measurement that goes from unstressed to stressed, what would be a unit that goes from stressed to unstressed? It would be trochee. Bingo. Okay, so versus the trochee. Good. Okay, and then pentameter. So the Greek word penta, what does that mean? 5. Good. Okay, and then meter. How can we define meter? In terms of poetry, it's the rhythm. It's a pattern, right? It's specifically a syllabic pattern. Syllabic pattern in poetry. Okay? So what that means is that this one unit, this unstressed to stressed syllable, is repeated 5 times. And that's what creates iambic pentameter. Okay, so in addition to all of these elements for the sonnet is that every single line has exactly 10 syllables. Okay, so now I'm going to get to how we break them down and identify whether or not it rises and falls or starts high and goes low. Everybody have this so far? Okay. So I have a new example. Your heart beat has been telling you for years. Okay, so that, let's just imagine that's one line of verse in a sonnet. If we're trying to use, do you guys remember what is that vocabulary term that means basically the system for measuring meter? Do you remember that term?
A foot.
Not quite. It's so a foot is the individual unit. So it's the term that means what's the system of measuring? In other words, how do we count meter in poetry? Any takers? Scansian? Remember that one? So it's the system of measuring meter. Okay, and remember it's the little U's and then the strong dash mark, and that's how you show the emphasis between different syllables. Is that familiar? Okay. Okay, so here's our example. Your heartbeat has been telling you for years. So first we need to figure out, are there 10 syllables? Okay, so you brought up the term foot, right? So a foot is one single unit of measurement. So an IM is 1 foot that goes from unstressed to stressed. So let's start by counting it off so that we can figure out exactly how many syllables are here. So can you help me count the feet? Okay, so where would I put like a division in this line to make sure that we have 5 different feet?
After heart.
Okay? Even though it's part of one word?
Yep.
Okay. Your heart. Oops. Your heart. Your heart. Beat has been tell
You. For years.
Okay, so how many feet are in that line? 5 feet, and each foot has exactly 2 syllables. Okay, so now, depending on how we say it, you know, we could manipulate whether it's unstressed to stressed or stressed to unstressed. Don't get stressed about all the stresses. But this word telling right here, because it is a 2-syllable word, that's where we can really tell where the stresses need to go, okay? So if we went, your heartbeat has been telling you for years. Sure, they look like IMs, but to test it and make sure that I'm not just like manipulating my voice to make it work for the sake of my lesson, we can look at the word telling. Okay, so would the emphasis be on the tell or the ing? Is it tell ing or is it, oops, tell ing? Say it to yourself. Telling. 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 Does it go high to low or low to high? Telling, right? So the emphasis, the stress is on the first part of the word, no matter what we do to it. We wouldn't say telling, we would say telling. That's how, that's where the stress is on the syllable. So if we know that for sure about telling, we can start by putting a stress here and an unstressed here, right? So then to follow order, because that's really the only one that kind of like maintains the integrity of the line, we can count them off. Your heart beat has been telling you for years. Okay? So is it iambic pentameter? Right? Okay. And I kind of like that one just because what they're saying is like our heartbeats, right? Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. So it's like our heartbeat has been telling us for years what the sound of iambic pentameter makes. Savvy? Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples. And as soon as we're done with the notes, then we're going to break off and you guys are going to play a little competitive game. I have a puzzle for you to put together, and when a winning team has been crowned, there will be a prize, as always. Okay? So, okay, again, it's the trickier part of this is really just in determining where the stresses go, right? Because if you're just kind of following along with me, you can go, okay, well, like always, Darwin says it's so maybe there's a system or maybe we're just going along with it. Okay, so if you look at specific words, like in semantics, basically, words that look the same and maybe are spelled exactly the same, but depending on where your stresses are, where the emphasis is, it changes the entire meaning. Okay, so this is my best example that I could come up with. Consider the sound of the underlined word in each passage. Speak the underlined word aloud. Darth Vader decided to crush the rebel soldier. Okay? Luke Skywalker will rebel against his father's wishes. Now these two words, rebel and rebel, they are spelled exactly the same way, right? So how did I know which was which when I read those two sentences? Context, right? I mean, I didn't have to pause, I didn't have to go forward or back. It just becomes kind of second nature. That's how we read. We use the context clues to figure it out. But in poetry, we don't always have the context, especially when you're reading 17th, 18th, 19th century poetry. that oftentimes has vocabulary that isn't even really